Before the break, we were talking about the different model for how you actually take the idea in these complicated markets and drive scale. Right? It's a different toolkit. We threw around words like regulatory hacking, and we briefly talked about things like passing legislation, and is there a different business model to go after these markets? And so many of the speakers this semester are going to come in and talk about that, but today we've got a special speaker to really kick all of this off, which Tom Davidson is the CEO of EverFi, and I'll ask him to really drill in and talk about what EverFi does and why it does it, and give you a little bit of the founder story around that. But one of the things that I love about EverFi is that they epitomize the idea that you don't just simply take your problem and put it into the open slot. You think differently about what's the business model here that can really drive scale. And they've been very creative about making that happen. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Awesome.
Take it away.
Thank you. So I have no idea if you actually have to be here tonight, so thank you for being here. This is super fun for me to come out and talk to folks, and I really appreciate your interest in the subject itself. It's something that I care a ton about, and I've cared about for a long time. I come out this, I'm just going to give you a couple minutes because everybody always talks about Uber and EverFi, Uber and EverFi, Uber and EverFi. The reality is no one knows who we are. That's kind of by design. And tell you a little bit about my background and how we got started in this and what really drove the thinking behind what I think is, going to be the biggest story. I think our story is going to be, if not the biggest, one of the biggest stories in the education space for years to come, and we're working hard to make it happen. So I came at this with a little, talk about entrepreneurial. I went to college at Bowdoin in Brunswick, Maine, and had a harebrained idea to run for the state legislature when I was in college, and went out and knocked on some 38,000 some odd doors, and somehow won a really competitive primary election my senior year, and then got elected in the general in November. So I cared a ton about issues. I didn't know what I was doing and whatsoever, and I'm not even sure I totally knew what I believed at that point, although I told everybody, in a right or wrong, never in doubt way that I knew exactly what I wanted to do about water utility deregulation and deer decoy policy on roads. And but it was a fascinating experience, and it opened me up to really ended up spending a ton of time on education in schools. And it didn't take a rocket scientist to begin to understand that if you were born in the wrong zip code in the United States, that you were just flat out screwed. And you weren't just screwed from the beginning, you were screwed all the way through. That was the period hard stop on your life. So best advice I can give you in the United States right now is do not be a poor 4-year-old boy living in an under-resourced community. Unless you want to go to jail, unless you want to be in a direct pipeline out of, into the criminal justice system or other areas. It's a devastating fact, and it's something that was just mind-boggling for me. It makes me angry, it makes me anxious, it brings a ton of anxiety on me, and I think it's incredibly unfair. And it's something that drove a lot of my thinking around this. And one of the reasons why kids who are born into the wrong zip codes in the United States are in kind of rough shape at best is that there's just a totally fractured funding system for schools in low-income communities. Now, that may sound like a really basic idea, and you say, well, yeah, but the reality is that the tax base and all of these complicated things basically set it up so that a school, a stone's throw away from another school will just be set up entirely differently in terms of how they're funded, kind of resources they have, the really great things that often come from schools to schools that are highly resourced. And so that was really the light that went off in my head, was that you had to create some kind of private funding mechanism, some way to bring the best innovation and the greatest resources and things to schools that typically didn't have them, and have the private sector virtually pay for all of that. And that was really the big idea behind EverFi. And we went out and got a whole bunch of really smart people, Jeff Bezos and Evan Williams, the founder of Twitter, and Eric Schmidt from Google and others to put a pretty significant amount of money behind us, but not before I started the company with $11,000 and an RV and drove across the country for many years, just meeting with school districts and others. As my wife will tell you, who's here with me tonight and tagging along, so much of this is a confidence game, so much so that maybe Donna's heard this story before. The night before we had closed $11 million of our Series A financing from really the best venture capital firms on the planet and people on the planet, my credit cards would no longer work, and I had to sleep on a couch in this crappy hotel in the middle of North Carolina, and the next day our financing closed. I literally don't know what would have happened if we wouldn't have closed it then. So all of the kind of ramen stories and everything else that you hear from entrepreneurs, I've definitely have lived. Now, one of the interesting things about companies like EverFi, and Donna and I will talk a little bit more in the Q&A period, is that these are really different animals than other companies, than consumer tech companies or media companies or e-commerce companies or others. They're meant to be different. They solve different kinds of problems. But you know what's interesting about the biggest challenge that I think that those of us who run what I would call, or maybe you would call, a socially responsible company, a social impact company, being a social entrepreneur, is never calling yourself that. If there's one message that I would leave for you all that are thinking about going into this kind of work, is that I have never, the fastest way that you get sent to timeout in our company is if you use the term social entrepreneur. If you categorize yourself as a social impact story. And it's something that has always just kind of, I don't know why it's bothered me. I mean, you'd think that there's a lot of other things that should bother you, but it's really like kind of bothers me sometimes when, because I think a lot of times it diminishes actually the size and the scope of the problems that you're trying to solve. A lot of people think it actually elevates it, but in reality, I think it kind of diminishes it. Big companies that you read about, like, Donna mentioned Uber and Slack, and these companies that get a lot of attention are trying to solve really big, complicated problems between organizations and cities and others. Those are big ideas. They're big problems. They take a lot of money to pull off. They're huge, intractable issues often within organizations and stuff, as are the issues we're dealing with when we start companies that have some kind of social shrapnel to them, right? So if you think about clean water, environmental, if you think about education, healthcare, and others, what often happens is you have entrepreneurs who end up playing wiffle ball. And I tell people all the time, I'm like, man, you're just playing wiffle ball. Like, you got to go into a pitch that's high and tight here and fast, because we do things like we say, hey, Matt, we're giving 10% of our profits to charity that we make. We're going to match 1 for 1, these sunglasses or shoes or things like that. And what we do is, I think, and people hate this idea, by the way. It's like Blake, who's my buddy from Tom's Shoes, always wants to kill me when I say this stuff. It is interesting because I think you begin to kind of apologize for having a company that's attacking really big, intractable issues. It's like from day one, we start saying, I get asked all the time, are you trying to make money do this? And my answer is, no, I'm trying to make a shit ton of money doing this. Because why not? You know what I do every year? I think all of you probably took this class. And you probably hated Alcohol EDU and Haven, which is our sexual assault prevention course. How many of you took Alcohol EDU in college? So these are courses that are set up to, go right after campus sexual assault, rape and campus violence, These are hugely important issues. You have 1.2 million students a year go through that. That's an absolutely wonderful thing. Why are we not cheering on people who are taking a lot of risk to take on issues like these as a company, not as a nonprofit, not as a C3, not as something else, but as a company. So I always really kind of push back on folks and say, when people come to me and they say, I'm thinking about doing this company and I really want to attack early stage reading and development or social and emotional learning for kids or wiring smart cities or renewable energy or things like that. My biggest piece of advice is, don't make it any harder on yourself. Go build a great company that solves really significant problems. Don't apologize for it. Don't put any kooky business models around it. It is hard enough to build a company than to have these kind of artificial parentheses around what you do. And I think that that's a really important thing. The education space is one of the areas that's really, really difficult to do that in. Because if you look across all of these areas right here, even smart cities, particularly smart cities, transportation, energy, healthcare, and others, here's an interesting question. What's the one thing that the education system doesn't have that all the rest of these do? Who's got an answer to that? Go ahead. Yeah, so one of the answers is a public good. It's interesting because it's certainly kind of meant that these are kind of, I always say to folks, the end user often isn't the student, it's the end user we should think about as the community that student grows up in. And we have to think about it a little differently. What I think is, or what's patently missing from the education space is that there's no thriving private sector that exists in the education space. No thriving private sector. Transportation space, you have it. In the energy space, you have it. The healthcare space, you have it. It's driving innovation around drugs, driving innovation around healthcare delivery, driving innovation around cars and transportation systems and smart rail systems and everything else. And in the education system, you basically have zero. Zippo, zero. And you know what that's doing? And everybody sits around and says, well, why is this busted? Why aren't we more innovative? Why aren't we solving these problems? And one of the reasons why is because we basically left it to the nonprofit community. And God bless the teachers that we work with every day who are handling insane amounts of pressure that kids are under and stress that kids are under in the classroom. And so it's kind of a cocktail that has not, I always kind of say, how's that working out for you? It's not working out for us very well. The results are, and it's not because teachers aren't killing themselves and are incredibly smart and working every day to try and make that happen. So that's an area that I think is really critical to have a big private sector. And so what EverFi does is we build out these really sophisticated programs that teach kids areas that the data shows you have a huge impact on whether they succeed in life. So things like summer learning loss. Students lose, in low-income communities, lose about 38% of their math and reading skills over the course of the summer. But that's all paid for by the private sector in schools. Financial literacy, so teaching students in schools about how mortgages work, how credit works, how a payday lender works, how compounding interest works, how savings works, and FAFSA forms and student loans. Again, that goes into schools, about 22,000 of them, and it's all paid for by the private sector. And so that is a really, it's a really different business model. It's a hard one for people to get their arms around because it's for the first time you're creating a third-party payer system in the education space. It's never existed before. It's highly confusing. It's highly difficult to do. But we have about 2.5 million students every year at EverFi who get fully certified through our programs, and some of the very, very toughest school districts in the country in terms of funding levels. And those kids go through, and there's absolutely zero cost to the schools and the communities that that those students live in. So these, what I would call these socially responsible businesses have to really figure out how to get leverage. You can't do it on your own, but you have to go get the private sector and others who have a stake in the game to pay a very significant part of the freight, and particularly around these areas of huge intractable social issues. Last thing I would say is this. I think that this is, for those of you who are thinking about these areas, for those of you who are thinking about going and working at a company in these areas, and maybe something in these spaces behind me, people will get up all the time and be like, this is the best time in the world to start a company like this. This is the best time in the world to go work at a company like this. And I'll tell you why. It's not because technology is transforming so much, transforming drug delivery and transforming healthcare services and all the things. Like, we know that, right? It's just absolutely incredible what's going on, and the compounding effect of how technology and innovation is affecting those areas. It's happening in education too. It's a super exciting time. I tell people all the time, you should feel so good about what's going on in schools right now and the type of risk and investment that's happening in schools. That's not where actually the change is coming. The change is coming right down the street. And what's exciting about this class is kind of where the hat that I wear often, which is the regulatory hat. Whether you like it or not, that joint down the street is ground to a halt. And it's becoming very, very difficult to pull off very big ideas now out of kind of the legislative morass that we're in. It's just tough. Like, there's, you're going to see kind of little things happen. But I think that, you know, for the most part across these areas, the private sector is going to actually step up more and more to create systems that augment things like Medicare and Medicaid, that augment transportation systems, Social Security, that you're going to see people who stand up and say, you know what, we're going to kind of do this outside of the regulatory and political environment. We're going to, frankly, do it on our own. And you're starting to see actually a lot of that. We talked about O-Power a little earlier. I mean, that's a real fascinating response to energy efficiency that people have been trying to figure out for a long time. And you're going to see more and more issues like that, companies like that going forward. And it's a really, really awesome time to be thinking about these issues and how companies can solve them, and less leaning constantly on the nonprofits and the public sector to answer all of these issues for us. So that's kind of the opening. Maybe, Donna, if you want to, we can spend a little time on some questions, then we'll open it up to you all and go from there.
Great, thank you.